The wind came down off the high country like something with a grudge, shoving snow in hard sideways fists that rattled the shutters and skated icy pellets across the porch. Thomas had opened the door only a crack to check the latch habit born of winters that took what they wanted when a figure rose out of the white. For a breath, he thought it was a drift come alive. Then the drift spoke. "I can sleep in the barn," the woman said, voice rough but steady. "Just a corner, just a little warmth. Please." She stood without huddling, as if dignity were the last blanket she owned. A torn cloak clung to her shoulders, soaked through and stiffening at the edges. Dark hair was braided and half frozen to her cheek. The hem of her dress was crusted with snow, and Thomas's gaze snagged there a dark, dried edge of blood, where winter had not bothered to hide the truth. Her hands were bare, raw. She held them close to her ribs to keep them from shaking, and did not step forward. Thomas kept one palm on the door, and the other within easy reach of the rifle that lived behind the coat rack. He had learned not to gamble on kindness. Kindness out here got people buried under pines. The storm hissed impatient, flinging powder into the open seam between them. The woman didn't beg. She didn't even glance past his shoulder toward the fire. She waited like a soldier awaiting orders. "I don't take in strangers," Thomas said, words, careful voice flat to keep it from sounding like an apology. "I'm not asking to be taken in," she answered. "Only not to die on your porch." The plainness of it set something tight in his chest. Snow pinned her like tacks. The world around them was white and hungry, and getting darker by the minute. He had almost shaped the word no, the simplest word, the safest, when small footsteps padded the hallway behind him. Daddy Rose blinked up, 4-year-old nightgown grazing her ankles, feet pink from the cold floorboards. Her hair was a pale tangle, her eyes the color of creek ice in spring. She peered around Thomas's leg at the woman on the threshold and tilted her head as if listening for something only she could hear. Mama Rose said. The sound was soft as a moth, but in the quiet between gusts, it landed like a bell. Thomas felt the floor tilt under him. "She's not your Mama Rosie," he said gently, keeping his voice low so the storm wouldn't steal it. "Back to bed." Rose frowned in the stubborn way her mother used to, the line between her eyebrows a tiny lightning stroke. "She smells like my dream," she whispered, and then as if that settled it, reached small fingers toward the cold air where the stranger stood. The woman's lips parted, not to claim the name, not to refuse it. Something like pain flickered and was swallowed by composure. She kept her hands at her sides and looked at Thomas, not pleading, simply present, as if the choice, his choice, were the only true thing left in the world. He felt the old ache lift the one winter's always woke loss rubbing bone. He saw the hem again, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she made herself taller than hunger. "There's straw in the far corner of the barn," he said at last. "Blankets in the tack room. The door sticks. Lift and shove." She nodded like a scout repeating a route. Lift and shove. "I won't trouble the house." He stepped aside so she could warm her hands by the hearth for a heartbeat. She kept her distance palms open to the heat steam rising from the red cracks across her knuckles. Rose watched her with solemn wonder, thumb hooked in the seam of her nightgown. The woman didn't meet the child's eyes. She stared into the flames as if memorizing them, then pulled her cloak close and turned back into the weather. Across the yard, the barn was a smudge in the white, its roof wearing a hump-sinking hat of snow. The woman's steps were careful, measured, leaving a thin string of prints that the wind immediately set about untying. Thomas stood in the door long enough to see her lift and shove the warped barn door slip through and vanish into the dark. He shut the house against the storm and the silence that came with it. Rose lingered, still staring at the window. "She's cold," she murmured. "I know," Thomas said. He scooped the girl up. She folded small and sure against his chest heartbeat, fast as a rabbit's. "She isn't your mama." "She didn't say she wasn't," Rose replied, child logic, plain as daylight. He tucked her in, waited for her breath to settle. Back downstairs, he added 2 more logs to the fire, then a third, more heat to the chimney wall, more warmth bleeding outward to where the barn snugged close. He told himself it was efficiency. He told himself it was for the horses. He told himself a lot of things while the wind clawed and the latch rattled, and he pictured a stranger arranging her bones in straw, refusing to bend even to sleep. On the mantel, Eliza's silver keepsake dove, caught a tongue of firelight, and winked. Thomas looked away. A man could be carved hollow by grief and still feel the weight of another human's winter. He checked the rifle, checked the window, checked the clock that didn't care about storms. Then he pulled on his coat, took a kettle to fill, and stepped into the night. The gust slapped him for the audacity, but he went anyway, following the thin idea of footprints across the yard. He told himself he was only going to bolt the barn door proper. Maybe fetch kindling. Maybe set a kettle on the pot-bellied stove out there and leave before thanks could get in the way. This, he thought, is not kindness. This is weather sense. But the truth, sour and warm, sat under his ribs. A stranger had asked not to die on his porch, and his daughter had called her by the name that breaks and mends a man in the same breath. Out here, where mercy could be a mistake, he found his hand on the barn latch anyway. Lift and shove. The door gave. Straw sighed. A horse snorted. In the dark, a woman breathed like someone who had wrestled the night and for now won. The first morning broke pale and brittle, the world outside hushed beneath a crust of new snow. From the porch, Thomas watched the barn door creak open. The stranger stepped out, her shoulders dusted in white, her dress still damp from the night, but her spine straight as if pride alone held her upright. She looked more like someone leaving a church pew than crawling out of a pile of straw. He had a tin cup of coffee in his hand, its steam curling into the air between them. "You're up early," he said gruffer than he meant. "I did not sleep much," she replied. Her voice was steady, but her eyes dark and careful slid away from his. "What's your name?" She hesitated, fingers twisted in her cloak as if searching pockets that weren't there. Finally, soft as a prayer, "Clara." "I think it's Clara. That's all I know." It was the truth, or the closest she could come to it, and Thomas, hardened by years of lies in men's mouths, felt no need to test it. He only nodded, his expression unreadable, as if weighing a ledger with no columns yet filled. Then the quiet broke. Rose burst from the doorway in bare feet, hair flying, her doll forgotten in the rush. She barreled straight for Clara and clung tight around her skirts, small arms claiming what no law or memory had yet granted. Thomas's jaw tightened. Clara froze, caught between stepping back and kneeling down. Her hand hovered, then settled gently on the child's hair. Snowflakes melted on her palm. The storm had eased, but the air thickened with something harder to name, an entanglement born not of blood, but of need dreams and a little girl's unshaken choice. By midday, the snow had softened into slush along the yard, and Clara had already set herself to work without waiting for permission. She stood on the porch with a borrowed broom, sweeping the drifts clear from the steps. The wind tugged at her cloak, but her strokes were steady, practiced, as if this labor was nothing new to her hands. When she finished the porch, she crossed to the path between barn and well, stooping to shovel snow aside until a neat track cut through the yard. Later, she carried the tin dishes from breakfast to the basin and scrubbed them briskly, sleeves rolled to her elbows, each motion sure and efficient. There was no chatter, no plea for notice, just work done with the rhythm of someone who had earned her bread before and meant to again. Thomas watched from a distance, arms crossed, his expression carved tight as oak. She had said earlier, with the same calm she carried now, "Let me stay. I will work. I will earn my keep." He had not answered, not in words, but he hadn't told her to leave either. And there under the pale light, Rose followed Clara everywhere, trailing her cloak as she swept, clutching her skirt as she bent to rinse the dishes. The little girl's face, once shuttered by grief, was alight with an unspoken claim she had chosen this woman. Thomas turned away at last, jaw clenched, knowing silence itself was already an answer. Clara was still here, and maybe for the first time in years that felt right. That evening when the house had gone still and only the fire whispered in the grate, Thomas passed the pantry door and caught a glimpse he hadn't meant to see. Clara stood near the stove, brushing her damp dress dry. Her braid had slipped forward over one shoulder, and for a moment the back of her neck was exposed. There, just beneath the hairline, ran a pale scar, thin, deliberate, unmistakable. A bullet mark. Thomas's breath tightened. He knew the shape, had seen it on men who carried violence in their past. His jaw set hard, but he made no sound. He stepped back, boots too loud on the floorboards, retreating to his chair by the hearth. That night he lay awake longer than usual, the rifle within arm's reach, his ears tuned to every shift of wind against the shutters. Yet when he rose near midnight to check the barn, He carried with him not suspicion, but mercy, an extra blanket, and a kettle of warm water. He left them where she would find them without a word. In the morning, her eyes flickered once in recognition, but nothing was said. Still, the scar stayed with him. In the days that followed, Thomas's watchfulness deepened. He woke at the smallest noise, boots on before dawn, the colt resting across his lap while the world was yet dark. Clara never knew how often his gaze tracked her across the yard, how carefully he measured each of her silences. And yet he did not interfere. She swept, shoveled, mended. Rose laughed more in her company. The ranch's rhythm held steady. Thomas lived between two truths, the wariness carved by a scar, and the peace slowly knitting itself into his home. So he kept his weapon close and his suspicions closer, but he let the fragile pattern continue, unsure if danger had walked in or salvation. Snow fell, melted, and fell again, as if the mountains themselves were testing who would endure. In that rhythm of storm and thaw, Clara folded quietly into the ranch's life. She hauled water from the well with steady arms, split kindling without complaint, and cleared the paths until her boots were caked with ice and mud. Her movements carried the ease of someone long practiced at toil, though her past remained a mystery. Rose, once restless and fearful at every gust of wind, now trailed Clara's steps with growing confidence. She clung less to Thomas's leg and more to Clara's skirts, humming softly when they worked side by side. At night, the child no longer cried at shadows, but drifted to sleep knowing Clara was near. From the house, Thomas often caught himself standing by the window watching. The edge in his chest, once sharp as a drawn blade, dulled each time he saw Rose's laughter return. Clara. The morning was clear and cold, the kind that carried sound farther than it should. Thomas had just finished tightening the cinch on his mare when he spotted two riders climbing the ridge. Dust-colored coats, hats low, strangers with business written in their posture. He stepped onto the porch as they dismounted. One he recognized, the blacksmith's boy, grown heavy-booted and meaner than his father. The other bore the badge of a deputy, his face weathered like sun-dried leather. Morning, the deputy called, tipping his hat. "We heard tell there's a woman up here. Scar behind her ear. Fits the description of someone with a bounty on her head. Armed. Dangerous." Thomas crossed his arms, jaw working. "She's helping out. Watches the girl. Nothing more." The deputy narrowed his eyes. "You seen a mark on her neck?" Anything off. Thomas's gaze flicked almost involuntarily toward the barn where Clara stood in the yard, guiding Rose's small hands over a stack of kindling. Then he looked back, voice flat as iron. "No one like that here." The blacksmith's boy stepped forward, squinting. "Folks say she's trouble." Thomas came down the steps, boots crunching into the frost. "This land is mine, and on my land I decide who's dangerous." The words hung sharp in the air, a line drawn as clear as barbed wire. Neither man pressed further. After a tense pause, they mounted up and rode back down the trail, their warning half delivered, but their suspicion unresolved. From the porch, Thomas watched them go, his hand never far from the rifle leaning by the door. Behind him, Clara stood silently in the shadows, eyes wide, knowing she had been spared for now by his unflinching defense. Inside, the fire snapped softly, the kind of sound that made silence easier to bear. Clara sat at the edge of the rough-hewn table, hands clasped tight, knuckles pale. At last, her voice broke through the quiet. "They were asking about me, weren't they?" Thomas didn't pretend otherwise. He nodded once. "They were. And you lied." Her breath hitched, eyes lowered. "You saw the scar. You know what it means." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable, then said evenly, "A scar only tells me you survived something. It doesn't tell me who you are." The words struck deeper than any accusation. Clara's eyes shimmered, her throat tightening with a sob she hadn't meant to let out. She had expected suspicion, perhaps even banishment. Instead, she'd been given something rarer, trust she hadn't earned but desperately needed. Before she could answer, Rose patted in from the porch, her bare feet whispering against the boards. In her palm rested a single snowflake, fragile, melting as she held it out. "Mama," she whispered, offering it to Clara like treasure. Clara's tears spilled, then hot against the cold edge of fear. She took the tiny gift, watching it dissolve into her skin, and in that fleeting moment she felt anchored not to the past she couldn't remember, but to the present that held her now. Thomas looked on quietly, saying nothing more, but in his stillness was the same promise, whatever her history, Whatever her scars, here she was seen not as a fugitive, but as someone worth keeping. The night was sharp with wind, the kind of cold that cut bone and left silence ringing in its wake. Thomas woke to the sound of the barn door creaking open, snow slamming against the frame. He sat upright, instincts already burning, and found Clara's bedroll empty. Rose, he whispered to the child, curled tight in quilts. Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me. Her eyes widened, glistening, but she nodded. Thomas snatched his coat, his rifle slung across his back, and stepped out into the storm. The snow clawed at his cheeks, whiting out the path, but their faint, hurried impressions led away from the barn, small footprints nearly swallowed by drifting powder. He pressed on his boots, crunching his breath, rising like steam. The trail cut upward toward the ridge where pines bent against the gale. Thomas's chest burned not from the climb, but from the thought of what he might find. Then he saw her. Clara stood at the bluff's edge, her cloak whipping open hair, a black snarl in the wind. The moonlight painted her pale, her body fragile as ice. Clara, he called steady but low. She flinched but didn't turn. You should not be here. You shouldn't either. For a long moment the only sound was the wind's howl. Then her voice came cracked and frayed. I woke up and I could not breathe. What if they're right? What if I am dangerous? What if I forgot something terrible? Thomas stepped closer, slow as if coaxing a spooked colt. And what if you didn't? What if you were brave and someone lied? Her shoulders shook. I don't even know my name. What kind of person forgets who they are? The kind who's lived through hell, he said firmly. The kind who survived. Her laugh broke jagged and pained. I'm tired, Thomas. So tired. Maybe it would be easier if I just... No. His voice cut through the storm hard as stone warmed by fire. You do not have to be perfect. You do not have to remember everything. You only have to stay. That is all I'm asking. She turned, tears frozen on her lashes, doubt carved deep in her eyes. For a heartbeat, she swayed closer to the edge. Thomas lunged the last few steps, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her back from the drop. She collapsed against him, all bone and cold but alive. His grip was iron, his words a murmur against her hair. Stay until you remember, or until Rose believes you're her mother for good. That's enough. Her sobs were quiet, one escaping, like the sigh of a broken heart. She clung to him, then her body shaking, her voice almost lost in the storm. What if I fail her? Then I'll catch you, he answered. Same as now. They stood locked together, the blizzard raging around them, the stars burning cold and merciless above. Yet between them something held steady. Step by step, Thomas guided her down the ridge, his arm tight around her shoulders, her weight leaning heavy into him. By the time they reached the cabin, dawn's first gray light was smudging the horizon. Clara's breath came ragged, but she walked beside him no longer toward an ending, but toward a waiting fire. Inside, Rose stirred, her small voice soft with relief when she saw them. Clara knelt, gathering the child close, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she whispered not of leaving, but of staying. And Thomas, watching them both in the glow of the hearth, knew the fiercest battles were not fought with rifles or fists, but with words that anchored a soul. You don't have to be perfect. Just stay. Morning light spilled across the valley, pale and sharp after the storm. Clara stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the snow-laden pines. Something tugged at her mind, faint, insistent, like a half-forgotten melody. I dreamed of paper, she said suddenly, her voice uneven. Thomas looked up from the saddle strap he was mending. Paper, she nodded slowly. Envelopes sealed with wax. Maps too, ink lines fresh and careful. I was holding them, guarding them. Her fingers tightened on the sill. The images struck like sparks in the dark. It felt real, like I'd done it many times. She turned, eyes clouded with both fear and recognition. And there was a name. Thomas set the strap aside, steady as stone. Tell me. Her lips parted, trembling. Clara Langston. The sound startled her, both strange and deeply known. I believe that's who I am. Silence lingered, broken only by Rose's humming nearby. Thomas didn't question her, didn't press. He simply nodded once, meeting her gaze without judgment. Then keep following it, he said quietly. Every piece matters. Relief pricked behind her eyes. For the first time since she'd stumbled into his yard, she felt less like a stranger to herself. The past was still broken glass, but at least one shard had caught the light. The afternoon sun slanted pale through the rafters as Clara followed Thomas into the attic, searching for Rose's lost mittens. Dust drifted in golden motes, settling on forgotten trunks and bundles of rope. One trunk in particular caught her eye. Its leather straps cracked its corners, scarred by years of weather and weight. Something inside her chest pulled as though the wood itself whispered her name. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a stack of yellowed letters bound with a thin red string. She untied it with careful fingers, and the first page nearly stole her breath. To Miss Clara Langston, thank you for safe passage. My brother reached the northern line before dawn. He owes you his life. The words blurred as tears welled. More letters followed, different hands, different names, all offering thanks for guidance, for messages delivered, for courage taken on their behalf. Each one painted the outline of a woman who had carried secrets through snow and darkness, who had risked herself for others. Thomas stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. You were a courier, he said softly. During the war? Clara's throat tightened. The memories flickered in fragments, muddy wheels stuck in ruts, whispered coordinates, a pistol's flash. I rode between camps, she whispered, clutching a page. Carried maps, dispatches, maybe more. One mission, it went wrong. I remember the mud gunfire, someone shouting my name, and then blackness. Her hand rose unconsciously to the pale scar hidden beneath her hair. Thomas's eyes darkened. Someone betrayed you. Maybe they thought I was dead. Maybe they wanted me dead. Her voice cracked, but strength steadied beneath it. That scar, it wasn't a mark of guilt. It was the price of survival. For the first time since the snowstorm night, she'd stumbled into his yard, her back straightened without effort. She was not a criminal nor a lost cause. She had not been cast out because of shame, but because someone had tried to silence her. Thomas reached for the stack of letters, turning one over gently. Then you weren't running from nothing, he said. You carried weight most men wouldn't dare touch. That's who you are. Clara pressed the bundle to her chest. The words were only fragments, the memories still fractured. But her dignity, the part that frost and fear had tried to smother, stirred back to life. She was not defined by the blank spaces of her mind, but by the proof in her hands that she had once been brave and could be again. The attic grew quiet, save for the creak of beams and Rose's laughter rising faintly from below. In that silence, Clara Langston reclaimed not just a name, but a measure of herself. The snow had barely settled when hoofbeats broke the silence of the valley. Thomas stepped onto the porch, rifle slung, as an older man rode up, back straight, eyes sharp despite his years. He introduced himself as Amos Grady, once a scout on the Western Pass. His gaze cut toward Clara, and for a long moment he simply stared, as though memory and reality had finally caught each other. You were called Langston, he said, voice rough with certainty, the one who rode faster than death itself. From his coat he drew a worn leather pouch creased with age. Inside were letters, old dispatches, and words of thanks from men she had carried through fire and snow. Amos pressed them into her hands. You saved my brother's life, hauled him half a mile through sleet after he was shot. He named his daughter after you. Clara's throat ached as she traced the faded ink. Proof again, not only had she survived, she had mattered. But Amos had brought something else. Another letter folded carefully, its ink delicate but firm. Thomas froze when he saw the handwriting. It was Eliza's, his late wife. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Dearest Clara, should the world ever turn cruel, come west. My husband is kind, and you will always have a place by our fire. The words bridged years and sorrow, stitching trust between past and present. Clara looked up, tears burning. Thomas, usually stone, let his hand rest over hers. In that letter, Eliza had already given her blessing, long before either of them could have imagined this moment. Amos bowed his head. You were legend once, Miss Langston. Seems you're needed still. For the first time, Clara believed it. The cabin, long accustomed to silence, seemed to hold its breath as Thomas rose from his chair and crossed to the wooden box tucked near the hearth. It was small, plain, and worn smooth with age, something he rarely touched. With deliberate care, he opened the lid and withdrew an object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, the firelight caught on silver, gleaming softly against his rough hands. A metal shaped like a dove in flight, its edges dulled by years of being carried close. This belonged to Eliza. He said, his voice low, steady but heavy with memory. She wore it through storms, through the worst of winters. Said it reminded her that peace was worth fighting for, even when the world gave her nothing but grief. His gaze shifted to Clara, searching unwavering. She trusted you, Clara. She wrote that letter because she believed you had a place here, because she saw something good in you. And I do too. Clara froze, breath caught between disbelief and longing. When he pressed the metal into her palm, its cool weight felt like more than metal. It felt like inheritance of trust, of hope, of a bond that reached beyond the grave. Her fingers closed tightly around it, knuckles whitening as tears welled. For so long she had been uncertain of who she was, living under the shadow of doubt and forgotten memory. But in this moment she was no longer a stranger. She was chosen. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. I don't know if I can be the woman she believed I was, Clara whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and gratitude. Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. His words came firm like stone warmed by fire. You already are. You survived when you could have given up. You brought laughter back into this house. You carried kindness into Rose's life when she had only silence. That is more than enough. Rose, half asleep, stirred from the corner and patted to Clara's side. Seeing the silver metal glinting in Clara's hand, she pressed close, small arms winding around Clara's waist as if she had never belonged anywhere else. Clara pulled her in, pressing the dove against her heart, tears still streaking her face. The hearth crackled softly, filling the room with gold light. The house no longer felt like a monument to loss, no longer haunted by the absence of Eliza. Instead, it seemed to exhale, to stretch into a new rhythm, one marked by warmth, by trust, by the fragile but steady forming of a family. For the first time since Clara had stumbled out of the snow with nothing but a scar and a name, she felt the weight of belonging. Not because of what she remembered, but because she was believed in. And in that trust, the cabin was no longer silent, it was at peace. The snow was loosening its grip, softening into patches of slush and mud when Clara stood by the barn with her satchel slung over one shoulder. Her coat was buttoned to the throat, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains met the sky. She had known warmth here, laughter even, but in her heart she whispered, "It was borrowed. It was never mine." With one last glance at the cabin, she turned to leave. The creak of the front door broke her stride, followed by a small, frantic voice. Mama Rose burst into the yard barefoot in her nightdress, hair tangled from sleep, tears streaking her cheeks. She ran headlong through the wet earth and collided with Clara's waist, arms wrapping tight. "Don't go, Mama, please." Clara dropped her satchel and knelt, catching the child close. Rose clung with the desperate strength only a child could summon, sobbing into her coat. Clara's voice shook as she whispered, "I'm not your mother, Rose." But Rose only cried harder, lifting her face blotched and wet. "Yes, you are. I don't care what anyone says. I prayed for you and you came." Thomas's boots sounded across the yard, steady, deliberate. He stopped a few steps away, his face unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a storm of their own. Slowly he crouched beside them, voice low and calm. "Sweetheart, sometimes love needs space to find its way. Can you trust me with that?" Rose sniffled, trembling, then reluctantly nodded. Thomas lifted her into his arms, kissing her forehead, and carried her back toward the cabin, leaving Clara kneeling in the mud, torn between flight and the fragile, undeniable roots already binding her here. The morning air was restless, clouds pressed low over the ridge when Thomas crossed the yard with something small wrapped in cloth. Clara stood by the barn with her satchel at her boots, Rose's damp handprint still warming her sleeve. He stopped before her, breath white in the cool, and unfolded the cloth to a silver ring, hand-forged, time-worn, its band etched with a fine horizon that matched the mountains behind them. "I made it years ago," he said, voice steady but unguarded. "Carried it like a promise I couldn't speak. I thought it belonged to the life I lost. Now I know it belongs to the life we're making." He met her eyes. "You came here asking for scraps in a corner. You gave back a hearth. I don't want to offer only warmth anymore. I want to offer a home with you as my wife." Clara's fingers touched the ridged engraving. Wind tugged her hair, and uncertainty rose like a tide. "Thomas, I don't remember everything," she whispered. "There are names, places, whole rooms of myself, still dark. What if some piece returns and changes what you think of me?" He closed the distance, gentle certainty in his stance. "Then we light those rooms together. I don't love your missing pages. I love the woman holding the book. The one who stayed through the storm, who taught Rose to laugh again, who steadied my hands when the past shook them. That's who I'm asking. Her chest shivered with a small, surprised breath. What if I fail you? Then you fail beside me and we get back up. Home isn't the place without trouble, Clara. It's the place we refuse to leave when trouble knocks. The barn door creaked. Somewhere the wind bell sang a thin note. Clara looked toward the cabin window where a small face hovered, wide-eyed, hopeful. She felt the weight of that hope not like a burden, but like a blanket someone meant to share. Tears brightened the edge of her vision. Say it plain, she murmured, needing to hear the shape of it. Thomas nodded. Clara, I don't just want you warm. I want you home. Stay and be my wife. Silence gathered soft and living. She offered her hand, trembling only a little. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a touch loose, as if leaving space for the days ahead to fill. She laughed through a tear. It fits like a beginning. It is, he said. They leaned together, foreheads touching their breaths, making a small weather of their own. From the window, Rose's palms pressed to the glass. She whispered a prayer-shaped yes that no one heard and everyone felt. Clara looked up to Thomas and finally answered aloud. Yes. The word rang clear as iron on anvil. Thomas drew her into his arms in the yard, the mountains, the long ache of before everything rearranged itself around that single steady vow. Behind them, winter loosened, and the wind carried their promise homeward softly. A year later, the southern ridge of the Wren Ranch no longer looked abandoned. Where an old storehouse had once sagged in disrepair, a new sound carried children's voices rising and falling, a steady chorus of discovery. The building, once stacked with broken tools and forgotten gear, had been mended board by board, its windows widened to let in the mountain sun. Now it was a schoolhouse. Inside, Clara stood at the front, chalk in hand, her hair pinned loosely, and her voice calm but steady. She taught letters first, then small words, each syllable, lifting like fragile steps across a rope bridge. The children came from miles around, sons of trappers, daughters of ranch hands, children who had known too much silence. Some had lost mothers, others had never seen a classroom. At first they arrived shy, clutching pine cones or apples like offerings. But Clara's patience turned fear into habit, habit into hope. By autumn, their benches filled before dawn, little boots lined up along the wall. Thomas built the benches himself, planed smooth from timber hauled down the pass. He added a stove in the corner and shelves for worn readers. On colder days, he sat quietly at the back, listening as chalk scraped and children repeated new words. He spoke little, but his hands carved, while they learned foxes, horses, birds, small wooden figures tucked under benches as surprises. Rose grew with the rhythm of the place. She carried her father's carving knife clumsily, but her fox, crooked-eared and uneven, became her favorite. She named him Baldy, carried him in her pocket, showed him to the younger children with pride. Sometimes she read aloud during lessons, her voice once silent, now the strongest in the room. The ranch, once a place guarded by grief, now hummed with noise chalk, dust floating like snow laughter spilling out into the pines. Clara no longer asked who she had been before. Purpose had rooted her here deeper than memory. And Thomas, watching from the doorway, knew their lives had turned no longer defined by survival alone, but by the steady, quiet building of something that could last. Late one October evening, the ranch settled into its nightly quiet. The lanterns in the little schoolhouse had gone dark, and only the glow of the hearth kept the cabin warm. Upstairs, Rose tugged at Clara's sleeve, refusing to close her eyes until one request was granted. "Tell me the dream again," she whispered, curls brushing across the pillow. Clara sat beside her, smoothing the quilt. She spoke softly as though telling the story to the wind. Snow was falling. You were cold and you knocked on a door. It wasn't yours to open, but I opened it anyway. And you said, "I knew you would come." Rose smiled, eyelids heavy. "I knew you were my mama even before you did." Her voice faded into the rhythm of sleep, but the truth of it lingered like a candle's flame. Clara bent low, kissed her forehead, and let the moment seal itself in silence. Outside, the night spread wide and star-filled. Thomas sat on the porch steps, carving knife in hand a block of pine, balanced against his knee. When Clara joined him, he handed her a half-finished fox. "The ears always come out wrong," he muttered. She laughed gently, reshaping them with careful strokes. Side by side, they worked in comfortable quiet, the stars winking above as if listening in. Another child came by the school today, Clara said after a while. Riding with her father. She might be old enough by spring. Thomas glanced over. Think you'll have room? Clara nodded. I'll make room. Every child deserves a place where they can feel safe. He slid an arm around her shoulders. You've made one for all of us. She leaned into him, her hand brushing over the smooth fox ears she had just shaped. The night held them steady, two people who had once been strangers now, choosing day after day to stay. Below the valley whispered with wind through the pines. Above the stars stood witness. And on the porch of a ranch, once defined by loss, a family forged not by blood, but by choice sat together, certain that home was something they built one story and one child at a time. The stars shimmered like scattered lanterns above the ridge. The night hushed except for the distant echo of laughter drifting from the valley below. On the porch, Thomas set aside his carving knife and drew Clara into his arms. She rested against him, the smell of pine and wood smoke weaving with the warmth of his chest. For a long while neither spoke, as though words might disturb the fragile completeness that had settled over their world. Finally, Thomas's voice broke the quiet, low and unguarded. It wasn't me who built this place, he said, his chin brushing her hair. It was you. You're the one who turned a barnyard into something safe enough for Rose, safe enough for me. I never thought I'd see that again. Clara looked up at him, eyes glinting with the reflection of firelight from inside. She didn't answer with words, only pressed closer, letting his confession settle like a vow between them. Around them, the mountains breathed steady and timeless. The fire inside the cabin crackled, and Rose's soft giggle carried faintly through the walls as she played with the fox Thomas had carved. Safe, that was the word he had never dared to hope for, and now it lived here. In that moment, home was no longer a place of timber and stone. It was laughter in the dark warmth shared, and the quiet certainty of arms that chose not to let go. The story settles under the wide western sky, where winds are harsh, winters long, and survival often feels like the only prayer left to whisper. Yet within that unforgiving land, Thomas, Clara, and little Rose proved that a home is not born of walls or wealth, but of a choice repeated each day to stay, to endure, to protect one another quietly. They had no grand declarations, no polished speeches. What they built was steadier bread baked in silence, wood carved with patience, lessons given in a small schoolhouse, and laughter that thawed what grief had once frozen. Love in the West did not roar like a storm. It took root like a pine on the ridge, resilient, weathered, unshaken. And so when the snow fell again and the winds tested every shutter and door, this family did not break. They stood together not because the world was kind, but because they had chosen to make kindness stronger than the world. If their story lingers with you, remember this: the frontier was never just about dust and danger. It was about the courage to stay when leaving was easier, and the quiet strength of turning scraps of life into something whole. More stories wait, born of storms, healed by simple, enduring grace.